Zeona, how are you?
I'm good, Nicola, and how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. If you can please start off with just introducing yourself, who you are and where you live.
My name is Zeona Jacobs. I live in South Africa, but I'm currently in Switzerland, in Geneva,
Okay.
Switzerland.
Okay, lovely, thanks. And how has the lockdown been for you? I mean, how long have you guys been in lockdown for in Switzerland? Has there been any special rules and things that are different to what's happening here? And just your general experience, if you can share that, please.
So we've been in lockdown since the 16th of March, and the lockdown ended on the 26th of April.
Oh, wow.
Yes, and as in the coming day or two, there'll be a new announcement on what lockdown will look like or not look like. But for now, people have gone to work, but within specific industries, there are different regulations of how many people can be in the office, a little bit like South Africa, but not as strict.
Okay.
So to give you an idea of what the lockdown was, is everything was closed except hospitals, of course, doctors' offices, selected doctors' offices, and when doctors' offices were only open for emergencies. So if you were a specialist doctor, it was for an emergency patients only. Pharmacies were open, and then banks were operating with the possibility for people to withdraw money. But other than that, everything was closed.
Okay.
The experience for me was different because different from what South Africans are experiencing, because you could walk.
Oh, wow.
And you were allowed to be in groups of 5, no bigger than 5. So if you were in groups of 5, more than 5, you were fined.
Oh, wow. How much?
I think if you were over 5, it was 100 francs per person. Yeah. What was interesting is police were very visible throughout, basically just checking on where people are. What happened over the Easter weekend, for instance, was, a lot of people went out walking, but they restricted areas where they knew people would be walking. So there are a couple of rivers, because the weather was also very good. So people like walking along the river or going to have a picnic, and they would restrict certain areas where you could park, and so that it really meant that not many people could go through, still to maintain social distancing.
Okay. That's very interesting. I wanted to ask you something. I think I remember that you mentioned that you sometimes drive over the border to go buy some groceries. Groceries are quite expensive in Switzerland. So were you able to leave during the lockdown, or you had to just stay within the borders?
We had to stay within the borders.
Okay.
Because Geneva, where I am currently, is very close to certain parts of France. And there are a lot of French people who work in Switzerland. You had to have a special permit to come from France into Switzerland and to go back to France. For instance, a lot of the nurses in Geneva comes from France, so they came in from France. But we were not able to go across the border at all. It, in fact, reminded me a little bit about those deep, dark days of apartheid, where, the borders, some borders do not have border control. So it's just a street, a road, but they actually had a boom down, and they have concrete barriers that you could not drive through, to make sure people didn't leave the canton.
Wow. So the European Union of not having any borders reverted back to having all of those border control setups.
Yes.
Wow.
And those borders
Wow.
are still closed. You know, I was meant to fly back to South Africa on the 30th of March. 5 days before my flight, I got an email to say that, you know, the borders were closed, and South Africa was also in the process of closing their borders at that time. And Switzerland flights weren't, long haul flights were not happening at that point from Switzerland to South Africa. I then was able to get a flight for the 4th of May. And last week, Tuesday, I got an email to say that that flight will not be flying either.
Oh my word.
So what is interesting is that when the South African president, when our president just made a speech last week, he mentioned that the borders, you know, for international travel is still closed. But there might be some repatriation flights, either to bring foreigners to their respective countries or to bring South Africans back. But I've not been able to establish whether there are any repatriation flights coming back to South Africa. I have to just say, Nicola, that I've been most impressed with the South African embassy in Switzerland. They've been fantastic. The website is very clear on what you need to do. When you do report that you are in Switzerland, you get a very warm email back, finding out if you are okay, if things aren't going well, for you to inform the embassy, or to go to your local consular office, like for me here in Geneva, because the embassy is in Bern. So that has been, I feel very loved by my country, South Africa.
Oh, that's great. That's very,
it's really, it's really nice to have somebody, you know, a telephone number of somebody that I can call and find out what's going on. So that's been very, very positive.
That's wonderful. Sure. I mean, I suppose the other thing I wanted to ask you is, have you ever been scared? I mean, just looking at the numbers, it seems fairly high for a small population in Switzerland in terms of the COVID cases. But how has your feeling been?
You know, Nicola, I think the communication here is a little different from other countries, and also for me, in terms of what would create that fear. Here it's very clear, you know, that you protect vulnerable people, and vulnerable people would be the elderly, or people who have kind of a chest, upper respiratory tract problem. So if you are healthy here, you feel like you're going to be okay. So that's number one. So I've never really feared. The other thing about Switzerland is there's a lot of capacity in the hospitals here. So, you know, how they've managed, how they've prepared for an overwhelming number of people coming into the hospitals is they've just stopped all other kind of minor procedures, and they've created an emergency section for COVID, and they've created a section for general emergencies. General emergencies went significantly down in Switzerland during this period. So it seems as if people were like, there were less heart attacks, less injuries. It's as if less car accidents, because nobody was on the road. If you drove on the highway, you know, there was there's this one area that we drove through to go and walk. There's this rester à la maison, you know, just stop COVID, rester à la maison, just stay at home. So I think people are also extremely compliant here. You know, it's a very different way of responding to what's happening. There's very little resistance. So even if you go to the grocery store, and South Africa is doing the same, or you go to the bakery to buy bread, people are keeping the distance. Where I have found the distance has not been kept is with impatient teenagers who want to come into the bakery, and they just come closer and you just go, stay back. So I've not had much fear of being ill. What I have worried about is, when you go to the supermarket, for me, that is kind of the only place where I have felt vulnerable. But in general, I've not been fearful. And I think what made it easier is just that we could get out of the house and actually go into nature, as opposed to be, stuck. Because I worry about myself. If I were to be in South Africa, how would I cope just to be indoors 24/7, and I live alone, so how would that have been for me? I think that would have been much more difficult than the circumstances I have right now.
Yeah, no, it's been really hard for us, I have to admit. And Zeona, just one last question. Now that the lockdown has ended, have you been able to go to a restaurant, or are those not open yet?
No, restaurants are not open yet. So I think in 2 days' time, we'll know where the restaurants are open. But I'll give you a little anecdote, which is interesting about reintegration. On Tuesday, we received an invitation to go to somebody's house for dinner on Wednesday, tomorrow. And I must be honest, we're not ready. We're just not ready to go. So we agonized over this the whole weekend. Is it too early? What will take us back? How will we reintegrate? Okay, we'd be happy to go to somebody's house if we can have a drink in their garden, if they have not many people have big gardens like we can have in South Africa. So if they have a garden, but maybe we can meet in a park. How do you integrate again? So yeah. I think while, the fear, I haven't had a lot of fear in the past, it's a different fear now that you've been able to not get ill, and you now need to go back into the world, and you actually, I'm quite comfortable with my circumstances now. So and I think this is something people have to think about. How does reintegration happen for them?
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. Thanks for that. So, merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, madame, mademoiselle.
And I think it's right. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Thank you, Zeona. Bye-bye.
Pleasure, Nicola. Bye-bye.